Welcome back. We're joined again by Professor John Mearsheimer to discuss what's happening in Ukraine, Iran, and of course, US grand strategy in an increasingly confusing time. So thank you for coming back on, John. It's great to see you again.
You're welcome, Glenn. I'm glad to be back.
So I initially had intended a different topic, but as we see the bombing of Kiev last night, which according to the mayor, Klitschko, he argued this was the worst bombing of Kiev in the entire war. It begs the question, what does this mean? And also I've seen in other parts of the country, airfields being bombed, of military airfields, which again begs the question, why wait 4.5 years to go after these airfields? How are you assessing what the Russians are doing now?
Well, if you listen to a lot of the chatter surrounding this massive attack last night, it's seen as a reprisal for all of these drone attacks, these Ukrainian drone attacks into Russia. And the argument is that the Russians are getting tough now. When you hear that, and before you read about what the attacks looked like, you might think that what the Russians were going to do is go out and pound the civilian population, launch what might be called a classic punishment campaign. But it seems quite clear that that's not the case, that the Russians went after military, industrial targets, and they did not purposely attack civilians. According to the Kyiv Independent, 20 Ukrainians were killed. This is surely regrettable, but it's not a large number, and it does not represent a punishment campaign, a campaign designed to kill civilians. And what the Russians did was they launched a massive attack against, let's call them strategic targets. And they've done this in the past. There's not really that much new here. Yes, it was a massive attack, but as we know, there have been numerous occasions in the past where you've had massive attacks against military industrial targets. So I don't see how this could possibly represent a response to the drone attacks by the Ukrainians against the Russian heartland. It doesn't sort of add up to me. I think the Russians are probably going to spin it that way for public relations purposes to convince their Russian leaders will want to convince the domestic audience that they're responding to these drone attacks. But in reality, this is just what you would expect from the Russians and what we've seen from the Russians in terms of bombing campaigns. So that'd be my basic assessment of what's going on here.
Yeah, no, I know the media reports point to the larger killing of civilians, but as you said, in the past you would have like hundreds of drones and missiles, and you may have one or two deaths. This time it was more, relatively many more. But that being said, as you said, if you launch 500 missiles and drones, if the intention is to kill civilians, you're doing a very poor job. So it doesn't appear, as you said, this was a aim to target civilians. Again, doesn't mean that the 20 deaths isn't horrible, but again, I think the context is important. But how do you see? Because many assume that when a retaliation comes from Russia, that it might not be restricted to Ukraine. Again, the Russians keep pointing to European production facilities as legitimate targets or logistics centers. But it does beg the question, how involved is NATO here actually? Because this is something that's very much, often disputed. Although I'm not sure if you saw the news today, you had these two Russian pranksters. They had called the advisor to the Estonian president and essentially had him go on about how they had been offering coordinates in the attacks on St. Petersburg. This is quite significant. It would indicate, make it very clear that NATO countries are involved in the attacks on Russia. Indeed, Maria Zakharova said this, that this is evidence of Estonian participation in terrorist attacks on Russia. So again, how do you see this? Because this is widely contested. depending on where you get your news. But how involved do you see NATO being in these attacks?
Well, there's no question that NATO is deeply involved, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I would note, if you look at the declaration that came out after the G7 meeting in France, this was on June 17th when the declaration came out after the meetings were concluded. The G7 countries said that they were going to accelerate their support for the long-range bombing campaign by Ukraine into Russia. This is really quite remarkable. They said they were going to accelerate it. And then furthermore, they said in this statement that was issued after the G7 meeting that they were going to ramp up the economic pressure on Russia. So if anybody in the Kremlin had any doubts about what the goals of the Europeans and the Americans are, they should have been dispelled as a result of what happened in France at this meeting. And by the way, it seems quite clear from what happened at this meeting that Trump was convinced that what the Ukrainians are doing is really quite impressive. And if anything, they should act more boldly. This has been widely reported in the Ukrainian press to be what Trump told Zelensky. So it looks like the United States is getting more involved these days than it has been over the past few months in putting military pressure on Ukraine. Military pressure on Russia by the Ukrainians. Now, there's no question that we in the West have been providing all sorts of intelligence to the Ukrainians. And furthermore, supporting them by giving them drones and helping them develop their own drones. And I would imagine even helping them plan a number of the drone offensives that have taken place. And furthermore, as we well know, there have been all sorts of instances where Ukrainian drones flew over the Baltic states. And the Russians have not reacted to any of that. But they have made it clear that if any drones are launched from territory in the Baltic states, they will attack those launch sites. So that is, I think, at the moment, the most likely scenario for where you get a situation where Russia actually attacks a European, or to put it in more specific terms, a NATO member state. And I think for that reason, none of the Baltic states are willing to allow Ukraine to actually launch drones from their territory. But if that happens, I believe the Russians would axiomatically respond. They would be foolish not to. But let's assume that that's not going to happen. Then the question is, are the Russians going to retaliate at some point against Europe, given Europe's and America's assistance to the Ukrainians? Is it time for Russia to sort of throw down the gauntlet and actually attack targets in Eastern Europe? And this, of course, is the Sergei Karaganov argument, that the time has come to do that. And what we have to do, we meaning the Russians here, is we have to attack with conventional weapons first. And if that doesn't get the Europeans and the Americans to stop helping with this drone war, then we have to turn to the nuclear weapons. My view on this, Glenn, and I'd be curious what you think, is that the Russians won't do that right away. And I think there are sort of two reasons for that. One is, I think they believe that they can parry those drone attacks quite well. Now, that's not to say they'll be able to do that over the long term, because again, the G7 countries said they were going to accelerate their efforts to help Ukraine with this drone campaign. So it may reach the point where the Russians have no choice but to retaliate. But at this point, it looks like the Russians are doing a reasonably good job of parrying the attacks. And as long as that's the case, I think the incentives for the Russians to attack into Europe are reduced significantly. The other thing that I think really matters here is what happens on the battlefield. If you believe this rhetoric in the West that the Russians are stymied on the battlefield, and if anything, they're losing on the battlefield and they're suffering massive casualties, then you can spin out a story where it might make really good sense to pursue the Karaganov policy. But the fact is, that's not what's happening on the battlefield. The Russians are actually doing quite well. They're not winning a quick victory. There's no question about that. This is a steamroller that's moving quite slowly. But nevertheless, the Russians are moving toward conquering all of Donbass. They don't have much left to conquer before they control all of that real estate. So given that the Russians are doing quite well on the battlefield, and given the fact that the Russians seem adept at parrying these drone attacks quite effectively, not perfectly, but quite effectively for the moment, I think the incentives for the Russians to go down the Karaganov road are not that great at the moment. But who knows how this is going to play itself out in the months ahead. So that's kind of how I see it. And I'd be curious to know what you think of my analysis.
No, I think that probably sounds correct. I mean, that's why I also have been a bit cautious about the way, or worried about the way many Western leaders talk about the need to bring war to Russia or increase the pain on Russia, because I think the main reason why Russia has been able to be restrained by not retaliating directly against any NATO country is exactly because the pain has been within the limit of being able to be absorbed and without having significant impact. So essentially being these pinpricks. So then they essentially say, well, instead of going after the puppet masters within NATO, we'll just take and we'll destroy and defeat their proxy. And I think this has been the main approach by the Kremlin. The problem, which is why I'm very worried when the European leaders, now seemingly the Americans as well, are setting the objective of increasing the pain on Russia, is that luxury of simply absorbing the pain goes away. And then there's more pressure of doing some direct strikes and risking a major war with the West. And again, it's speculation, but this would make sense, because what else can Russia do then if it's no longer sustainable? The attacks was assisted by the West. What are they going to do? Are they going to stop the war, accept a ceasefire where the West begins to rearm Ukraine in preparation of another war? I mean, are they going to leave Ukraine and have NATO march in thereafter? This is all capitulation, which would be an existential threat. So if there is no peace and the Western escalations aren't sustainable anymore, that is, they can't absorb the pain, then I think they will, from their perspective, they would have to strike Germany or the Baltic states, essentially putting the world at a new Cuban Missile Crisis. That is, either we go all out in war or you guys back off. And I think this is often what would be required, because often you see in human history, we do go all the way to the edge. And then once we face disaster, that's when state leaders begin to change their minds. Again, I could be wrong, but one thing I did want to ask you, though, when you say at the G7, they come with these comments like we have to accelerate the drone and missile attacks deep inside Russia. We saw NATO announce some $250,000 reward for strategies for targeting Russian airfields. Why are they so open now? I mean, they're less and less covert about this. Is this to normalize it, attacks on Russia, so the public won't be fearful of retaliation? Do they want a war? Is it to keep the US inside Europe by proving to the Americans there's nothing to fear? I mean, we could bomb the Kremlin tomorrow and the Russians would be too intimidated. It's just the openness of the whole thing. It's very strange for me to see.
Well, I think, Glenn, the Western elites, and we're talking here mainly about the European elites, have convinced themselves that Putin is the devil incarnate, that Russia has grandiose ambitions, and that we in the West are destined to fight a war with Russia at some point, hard to say where. But for the time being, we're in an intense security competition with the Russians. This is why we have to keep Ukraine intact. It's the battering ram. It's our principal weapon against the Russians while we're in the process of rearming for World War III. But you want to understand that that war is coming. It's just inevitable because Putin is he's this congenital aggressor, and he runs a country that has a rich history of aggression. So we really have no choice. Now, you and I both believe this argument is ludicrous, and I think ludicrous is an accurate word here. I don't understand where this story comes from, but that doesn't matter. They have been telling this story for so long now that I think they believe it. And I think that they have motivated, there's all sorts of motivated biases at play here that you were talking about. If you want to convince your public to support increased defense spending, this story fits perfectly. If you want to keep the Americans in, this story fits perfectly. So it's not, I think, like these people are saying, what can we do to get the Americans in? What can we do, or to keep the Americans in? What can we do to keep or increase public support for our policies? And then they come up with this particular strategy. I don't think that's what's going on. I think it's much more unconscious. And I think it all revolves around the fact that if you tell yourself these stories long enough, you really come to believe them. I think you see this in the United States with regard to Iran. People have been talking about Iran as this incredibly dangerous threat for so long, even though it's not a threat to the United States in any meaningful way, that nevertheless the elites believe, and most Americans believe. So, you and I have talked about this before. One of the downsides that we face of living in a world where facts and logic don't matter very much is that you end up in situations like the one that we face in Europe, where the Europeans, not the Russians, are talking about the inevitability of World War III. And the Russians are put in a position where they have come to conclude, well, if the Europeans think that war is inevitable and they're preparing for war against us, we have no choice but to prepare for that same war. And of course, once they do that, that provides ammunition for people in the West to say, oh, look at the Russians. They're the ones who are preparing for World War III. This is the classic security dilemma. Whatever the Russians do for defensive purposes looks offensive to people in the West, and vice versa. So we're in this spiral situation, which I don't see any way out of at this point in time. I mean, people like us try to talk sense in this discourse, but we're small voices compared to the mainstream media. That's the problem. So we have this situation where Western elites have convinced themselves that the Russians are truly dangerous and that we're heading for a major conflict down the road.